Hi everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and today I'm going to be having a game where spotting is just not enough. I've touched on this in a few recent videos on light tanks on the channel, and with the high explosive nerfs, light tanks feel as if they want to be able to have the same kind of impact that medium tanks can have, that it's now not enough to just provide vision for your team, because they're just not able to add to it. Especially on certain maps. Maps like the Tundra here, as I actually managed to get underneath the T100LT in that scenario. A bit of a bizarre beginning for this game. But while I fire around at the Leopard, I have to quickly react to the situation that is developing. And that is that unfortunately my T100LT friend is now getting clapped by the TVP. And I'm hoping that I can manage to track him. But even though I felt like I hit the track cleanly there, it was not enough to take it off the TVP. But in this scenario, we have to be fairly aggressive. We have to get rid of this TVP. The T100LT actually shuts him down, and that allows me to get a juicy shot into the side of a Chieftain. Probably the most meta tank in the game, right? 10 degrees of gun depression, 440 alpha damage, APCR rounds are standard, decent premium rounds as well, which are also APCR. Although I'm sure a lot of Clan Wars players would probably like the premium rounds on the Chieftain to be heat, unless they already are and I'm just having a brain malfunction. Anyway, let me focus on the point. And that is that, well, it looks like artillery is at least still good for one thing, and that is hounding down lightly armored vehicles, as the Conqueror gun carriage punishes me for, I guess, sitting still and actually trying to fight back against the mediums. When Wargaming nerfed high explosive rounds, and when they nerfed artillery's high explosive rounds, they made it so that artillery is now just as efficient, if not more efficient, against lightly armored tanks, and it's just armor that got buffed. Now, I've talked about this on the channel before. It's such a bizarre concept for me that Wargaming would want to buff already the most dominant tanks in the game, which are the heavily armored ones. If you go and take a look at the win ratios across all of the different tank types, it's all the ones that have decent amounts of armor that have the best win ratios. Almost as if we're playing a game of armor and World of Tanks, right? Yeah. Nevertheless, the artillery nerfs, they've hit light tanks extremely hard. And as we can see, the batch out, 15558 on my team. I'm not sure if they're trying to fire high explosive rounds. Maybe they're just memeing and trying to fire armor-piercing rounds. But all it really means is that previously, when it would be enough to spot 2 tank destroyers out in the open, albeit at the back of the map, it's just not enough to do it these days. And so I've had more success in my light tanks on maps like this by just trying to actually do the damage myself than trying to provide vision. Now, I'm not suggesting that you can't do both at the same time. It's not one or the other. Of course you can spot effectively while still trying to link in your shells in between your spots, or vice versa. Putting your shots in, then linking the spotting in between those, right? However, one thing that I really have noticed with my light tanks recently, and one of the reasons why the Manticore is actually not that bad, is that DPM on a light tank is one thing, but alpha damage is incredibly important. Because it takes about 15 seconds from when you're spotted till you're unspotted in World of Tanks, you pretty much have to hang back in a light tank, such as in this situation after we've just fired at the Leopard and got spotted, way beyond our actual reload before we can risk going back up into the bush and trying to fire another shell. This is why the Manticore, while it has a terrible rate of fire, is actually quite an efficient light tank. Because it doesn't matter that its rate of fire is so bad, because all of the other light tanks have to pull back behind the bush or have to pull back into cover and hide for 15 seconds to be able to then go back up and take another chance. And that is why reload doesn't particularly matter in these kind of scenarios for light vehicles. Unless you're all in and you're sitting there and you've got your turret exposed or your hull armor exposed and you're able to brush aside the tank like you can in a medium or a heavy, that's just something that is not possible in a light tank. And so I found that vehicles like the EBR and vehicles like the Manticore, which don't do silly things like on the Sheridan where they focus on damage, are actually incredibly proficient in this kind of shoot and then hide and then go back up and shoot and hide kind of gameplay. And it kind of makes up for the bad DPM that the vehicles have. And that's probably why the Manticore actually has one of, if not the best win ratios of any tier 10 light tank, EBR included. And so definitely take that into account when you're looking at your light tanks, that often the light tanks with the better alpha damage are performing well. And talk about alpha damage, Yeah, great. Looks like they've basically nerfed artillery, supporting light tanks against all of the mediums and the heavies, but they still absolutely clap lights, right? As that Conqueror gun carriage adds to the 301 damage they dealt to me earlier, doing 973, forcing me to use a repair kit, I believe on my engine or my ammo rack there, and my gun is still damaged. Well, shame on me for not spending 10 or 20,000 credits on a premium consumable just to be able to repair on a light tank, right? And so I have to now sit for the next 60 seconds with a damaged gun, which means that I have to really feel that I wanted to get right on the side, the broadside of the FV and slow down there. Not the FV, sorry. Broadside of the 705A and slow down. It really irritates me as somebody who likes the variety in World of Tanks that light tanks, because of the self-propelled gun nerfs, are in the worst position, I would argue, that they've ever been, with faster heavies, faster mediums, and now without even the kind of damage they're going to be able to get support unless they're playing on certain maps. Now there is one thing that can actually save a light tank with this regard, and that is that you can actually switch out your equipment. So with the new equipment 2.0, or relatively new equipment 2.0, in something like an EBR, you could have a spotting setup like I'm using here. Spoilers, I don't actually play the EBR that much. The stream doesn't really like it, and after playing thousands of games in wheeled vehicles over the years, I'm kind of a little bit bored of them now. And they're also in a far less competitive position than they've ever been in so far. But wheeled vehicles, within that regard, with equipment 2.0, are actually in a good position, because previously you'd always have to take coated optics, vents, and a commander's vision system on an EBR. But on a map like this, while it's definitely one that I would probably still rather use commander's vision system, vents, and coated optics, you could alternatively take a setup where you're focusing on your rate of fire and maybe even your survivability, or even possibly your camera rating, your mobility to be able to get around. However, that's in contradiction with the idea of using a gun rammer on this vehicle to everything that I just said, which was rate of fire doesn't really matter on a light tank because you have to hide anyway. So, oh my lord, there's a chieftain. Quick evasive maneuver, and luckily for me, I managed to dodge the shell there, and that could have been a game-losing moment. Well played to the chieftain for sneaking up on me there. I guess he was trying to get above the Super Conqueror, but luckily they choked the shot against the fast EBR, and then I had a nice, cool, calm moment to fire my final high-explosive anti-tank round into the chieftain. In retrospect, I use far too many high-explosive rounds on this vehicle now. I should definitely drop a couple of those out to be able to use maybe a couple of additional heat rounds on this tank. Now that the high-explosive rounds on this vehicle have been nerfed, whereas previously they have 105mm a pen, now they have 75. That's a huge nerf. But Wargaming have done that because of the way that tracks are less able to absorb high explosive rounds now, and they were incredibly worried that players were just going to spam HE at the side of vehicles with the HE changes. Now they no longer splash, they're worried about direct damage of high penetration rounds. Didn't change anything on the FV405, although that vehicle with its nerfs is not in the best position it's probably ever been in. But the EBR and light tanks, it's just so bizarre to me that in this game, this 8.5 minute round of World of Tanks so far, we've had to do nearly 7,400 damage. But look at the spotting, 0. And I really wouldn't argue that it was as if I wasn't trying to spot in this scenario. I was getting myself up on those ridge lines. I was putting myself in the position. I was spotting tank destroyers and self-propelled guns and heavy tanks in positions that I thought that my opponent, my team could be able to deal with my opponents. But it's just not the case. And I've been really noticing recently, unless you get on a map like Prokhorovka or Malinovka, and you get those tank destroyers helping you out, that light tanks are in such an awkward scenario now with vision because of the self-propelled gun nerfs and because of medium tanks getting faster and heavy tanks getting faster, that it's also becoming more difficult for them to have enough time to work their initial positions before the inevitable onslaught from vehicles with better armor, better DPM, and starting to get similar levels of mobility. And unfortunately, when you're not spotting, when you're not really securing kills for your 7,400 damage, this was not enough to be able to get an ace tanker for the EBR 105. Nevertheless, we got a Confederate medal, meaning that we damaged at least 6 opponents that were subsequently damaged by our, or shall I say, destroyed by our allies. In addition to this, unsurprisingly, a high caliber for that 7,400 damage. Oh, come on, Mr. Chieftain, you can't get ratioed by an EBR with regards to damage, right? Look, all jokes aside, this vehicle, I had a very lucky scenario where we were just constantly firing, and it's very unusual for a vehicle with 1,950 base DPM to be able to pump out that much damage with regards to continuous fire, unless you get an ammo rack or you're setting the enemy tanks on fire. But it's all about what I mentioned during the game, that the reload of 12 seconds on this tank doesn't really hinder it apart from in those all-in situations. But vehicles like this and the Manticore have enough mobility and enough camo rating to go into a position, fire, pull back, remain hidden, go into a different bush or a different position and fire again. And that's where alpha damage on the EBR of 390 and the Manticore is just so darn sweet. And we're going to have to continue to think of new ways to be able to build and play our light tanks to make them competitive, as the meta seems to try and do everything that it can to destroy them. And if you think that I'm exaggerating, in the last 30 days, there's only one light tank, according to Tomato GG, at tier 10 that has been able to achieve over a 50% win ratio, with vehicles like the Sheridan and the Rheinmetall Panzerwagen sitting all the way down at 46.67 and 46.49 respectively. You'd have to be mad to kind of want to play a light tank in the current meta of the game. And I'd be doing all but the most experienced and knowledgeable players a disservice if I suggested that you wouldn't be better playing a medium or a heavy. Anyway, ladies and gents, boys and girls, that was it for today. Really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. And let me know in the comments what you think about the state of light tanks. Are you like me, struggling to be able to get the spotting that you used to? Or are you doing just as well? And maybe I just need to go and learn a few new positions on the maps, right? And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.